Chapter 3, Part 4, we're going to look at how do you solve when you have errors and missing items on the balance sheet. This is similar, I believe, to one of your homework problems. So I'm going to show you how I do it. You may do it your own way. As long as we all get the same answer, that's fine. So the first thing you need to know is what are our balance sheet classifications. We know that assets, which we usually have more of, we have current, and we have what we call non-current. And those would include long-term investments, PP&E, intangible, and other, which is things that you can't put anywhere else. And then, of course, we have liabilities and equities. We have current, non-current, and then, of course, stockholders' equity made up of retained earnings and common stock at this point. Of course, there could be more types of stock. And we also know that these have to equal each other. So you have to always remember that when you're solving a problem, is that the accounting equation, assets equals liabilities and equity, have to always equal. That helps you solve. So now we're going to look at a problem. Now in this problem, we're missing information, and we know that we need to solve for these numbers. We need to know patents. We need to know what the total assets are. We need to know the common stock, the retained earnings, and the total liabilities and stockholders' equity. We also know that the total assets and the total liabilities and equity are the same, equal. And we're going to find those using the information provided. So I'm going to walk through all this information and show you how I would solve. Now, we're going to look at the information, and the first thing I would solve for is total equity. Now, we know in the problem it tells us the debt to equity ratio is 1.2. Now, how did they get that? They took the total liabilities and divided by the total equity. So, we first figure out what are our total liabilities. So we would add up total current liabilities plus our bonds and interest payable, and that would tell us that it equals $18,000. Now we can solve for total equity. We're going to take the $18,000, divide by some number equals 120%. We're then going to move the 1.2 to the other side of the formula, and that gives us $15,000 for our equity. Next, we can solve for retained earnings, where they give you the information. They tell us that beginning retained earnings is $4,000. We had net income of $1,560, and we know we have to subtract out the dividends, which tells us our ending retained earnings is $5,000. Now, if common stock equals $15,000 total equity minus ending retained earnings, we know our common stock is $10,000. Now we can come up with our total liabilities and stockholders' equity. So that would be $33,000, and that would be the same for our liability and equity as total assets. Now we have enough to solve for our patent. So to get the patent, we would take our total assets minus our assets without the patent of $27,600, and I got that by adding up all of our assets, and I get $5,400 as our net patents. Now we're going to look at the rest of the information to help us categorize items correctly. So first of all, we had missing information, and now we have information on the balance sheet that are not in the correct spot. So let's look at the rest of the information. On the rest of the information, management intends to sell the investment in the next 6 months. So of course, what's that going to do? It's going to make that a current short-term investment. Interest on both the note and the bonds is paid annually, which means that they would have to be a current liability. So we would have to take that $200 for interest payable on bonds and move it into current. We would have to take that, let me go back a little bit. We'd have to also take that $3,000 in investments under long-term assets and move it into current. Now, for the notes payable, we know a $1,000 installment is due each year, so we're going to have to take 1,000 of that and move it into current and leave only 3,000 in long-term liability. For the deferred revenue, 1,000 is current, but the balance is long-term, so we'd have to move that. And we're going to use the common stock to come up with earnings per share. So now what we're going to do is go through and identify where things go. I like to do this, and I have a checklist, make sure I've covered everything. So items 1 through 7 are going to be current assets. We have the cash, we have the investments, we have our accounts receivable, less of course allowance for doubtfuls. We have our raw materials, our finished goods, and our prepaid expenses. Let's look at PP&E. PP&E, of course, would be our equipment less our accumulated depreciation. Intangible would be our patent. Now let's look at our current liabilities. We have our accounts payable, our interest, and now we have 1,000 of that notes payable we have to include as current, and we have 1,000 of the deferred revenue we have to include as current, the balance long-term, and then of course we have this one that is long-term. Now we can actually prepare our financial statements, and this is what it would look like. Now if you notice on the balance sheet, I put this off to the side, the accounts receivable less allowance for doubtfuls, and only show the net amount in the column. I do the same thing with inventory. I do the same thing with equipment. I do the same thing with common stock. These are just subtotals. So this is what it would look like based on finding the correct. Now if you notice, when I finish, I still get total assets at 33,000, and I still get total liabilities at 33,000. It's just we've moved things around in current assets, and we've moved things around in liabilities and shareholders' equity, but they didn't leave that category. And that completes this presentation.